Hello and welcome. Today we will dive into a fascinating part of Afghanistan's history by exploring the life and leadership of Mohammad Zahir Shah, the last king of Afghanistan. Zahir Shah ruled from 1933 to 1973, a period of 40 years. Many Afghans today remember a time of relative peace and stability. Although he may not have revolutionized his country in the same way as other contemporary leaders tried to balance tradition and modernization, his attempt to navigate between East and West during the Cold War created some unique opportunities, but also challenges. So let us start from the beginning with a little background on Zahir Shah's early life. Mohammad Zahir Shah was born in 1914 in Kabul, Afghanistan, at a time when the country was already struggling with identity issues and geopolitical challenges. Afghanistan had a strong culture and religious identity, but it also found itself caught between great powers and tried to influence its politics and governance. Zahir Shah came from a family with deep-rooted traditions and strong connections to power, which naturally shaped his view on leadership. As a prince, he grew up in a world filled with expectations and traditions. He was the eldest son of Mohammad Zahir Shah, who was king of Afghanistan from 1929 to 1933. His family had great power and influence, and it was clear from a young age that he would one day inherit the throne. Zahir Shah received his education both at home and in France, which shaped him and gave him a broad perspective on the world outside Afghanistan. When he returned home, he saw Afghanistan with a different perspective than his predecessor. A perspective that was more interested in modernization and change, but at the same time deeply rooted in traditions. But becoming king was not something he expected at such an early age. When Zahir Shah was only 19 years old, his father, King Mohammad Zahir Shah, was murdered. This was a turning point in his life. As a young and inexperienced individual, he had to quickly adapt to the role of the country's leader. I believe that this sudden change indeed affected him deeply. He was still young, and instead of leading on his own, he relied on older and experienced advisors who had more influence, practical experience in politics, and valuable government work. His early life as a king, guidance, the initial years of his rule. Afghanistan was indirectly governed by his uncle Sardar Muhammad Hashim Khan, who acted as a prime minister and actually held a significant amount of power. This suited him well, since he was still young and had not yet developed a clear version of his kingdom. But during these years he saw what was required to govern such a complex and diverse country as Afghanistan. It is also here that we begin to see Zahir Shah's attempts to modernize Afghanistan, even though it progressed at a slow pace. One of his earliest and most well-known decisions was to gradually introduce reforms that would benefit education and infrastructure. It can be easy to criticize him for not moving faster, but he was a leader who understood the importance of creating change with caution, especially in a country where tradition and tribalism were so deeply rooted. What I personally find fascinating about Zahir Shah is how he balanced external forces from the superpowers of the Cold War. He understood both the USA and the Soviet Union had their own agendas in the region, but he chose to keep Afghanistan neutral. This is something that is very admirable, that he understood the importance of not letting the country become a pawn in others' games. During the Cold War, Afghanistan became an interesting country for both the USA and the Soviet Union. Because it was strategically located in the middle of Asia, both sides tried in various ways to gain influence over Afghanistan, but Zahir Shah managed to keep the country neutral by receiving aid from both sides without officially taking a stance for either of them. This requires an incredibly diplomatic skill and an understanding of how the major powers in the world operate. This neutrality meant that Afghanistan, under his rule, actually received aid from both the USA and the Soviet Union. It built schools, hospitals, roads, and other projects that helped the country modernize. This was Zahir Shah's vision, an Afghanistan that could indeed develop and become a modern nation, but on its own terms. It is a vision that can seem both idealistic and realistic, yet at the same time pragmatic. He did not want Afghanistan to become dependent on any specific foreign power, but aimed to create an independent and sovereign country. In 1964, Zahir Shah decided to introduce a new constitution that would change the country's political system. This was one of his most ambitious steps to modernize Afghanistan. The constitution represented a transition to a constitutional monarchy where the king would have a more symbolic role while the parliament would gain greater power. The constitution also guaranteed freedom of speech and granted women the right to participate in public life. This constitution reveals Zahir Shah's will to bring Afghanistan closer to a democratic governance. However, Although it was an important step, it was not a complete democracy. Many argue that the parliament never had enough power, and that the monarchy still held some strong influence over the country's political decisions. So even though it was a positive change, one could also say that it perhaps did not go far enough. But when we look back on it today, it was still a very significant reform that could have laid the foundation for a more democratic and stable Afghanistan. Of course, if later conflicts had not occurred. Under Zahir Shah's reign, Afghanistan gradually changed. He was a leader who truly believed in the importance of slow and stable development, rather than rapid and revolutionary changes. It may sound tragic or even cowardly, but even if we look at Afghanistan's cultural right, and given the political landscape, it is actually understandable why he chose this path. Afghanistan is a country with strong tribal structures and various ethnic groups, and implementing drastic changes risks creating significant tensions and conflicts. Zahir Shah wanted to avoid, and instead chose a more gradual development. He invested in education and urged more people to educate themselves, both in the country and abroad. I believe that he truly saw education as a tool for the future, an investment to create a generation that could move the country forward in a sustainable way. Under his rule, women also gained greater freedom. They were allowed to work, educate themselves, and participate in society in ways that had previously been uncommon. Kabul began to, more and more, it resembled a modern city with people dressing in a Western manner, and where women participated in the workforce and at the university. These were very significant steps for Afghanistan. Indeed, even though most of this change was concentrated in the cities. In the countryside, where traditional values were strong, the changes were slightly slower. But despite these advancements, Zahir Shah faced significant economic challenges. Afghanistan had no strong industrial base, and much of the economy was based on agriculture and informal activities. This economy was vulnerable to climate change, reliant on international aid. Zahir Shah tried to encourage foreign investors in an effort to generate new jobs, but it did not always go as planned. Many economic reforms never reached most remote parts of the country, and poverty remained high. This is something I think is important to highlight, as it shows the difficulties he had in truly uniting Afghanistan. The country was divided, and on one side we had the cities where modernization and education began to take root, but in the countryside things remained almost unchanged. In fact, this division created a certain level of concern and discontent, and many in the countryside felt that they were not able to partake in the new developments taking place in the cities. Many saw Zahir Shah's government as something that, in the eyes of many, mainly and predominantly benefited Kabul and its inhabitants. This increased widespread discontent. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, dissatisfaction with Zahir Shah's rule began to grow, especially the young were impatient and wanted more radical changes. They looked at the countries around them, say where revolutionary movements emerged. At the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, discontent with the ruling regime began to grow. Many, especially the young, were impatient and wanted more radical changes. They looked at the countries around them where revolutionary movements were emerging. And it was indeed inspired by the socialist ideology that grew powerful in the region. Students and academics who formed a growing middle class called for a faster pace of reform. They saw Zahir Shah's very cautious and extremely slow strategy as outdated and somewhat ineffective, perceived by many as being rather quite a bit outdated. Another problem was his relationship with his own relatives, particularly Mohammed Daoud Khan, his cousin. Daoud Khan had previously been the prime minister but had been removed from his position. Daoud was one of the strong advocates for modernization and had a more aggressive view on how Afghanistan should develop. He was partly inspired by socialist ideas and had a vision of a more progressive Afghanistan, which put him in conflict with Zahir Shah's more cautious style. In 1973, when Zahir Shah was abroad for medical treatment, Daoud saw his chance. He successfully organized a bloodless coup and took power in Afghanistan. This ultimately led to the end of the monarchy. Zahir Shah was deposed and would never return to Afghanistan as the country's king. It was a dramatic end for a leader who tried to balance tradition and modernity, and he was forced to live in exile in Italy for many years due to political reasons. When I look at this, I think that Zahir Shah was a leader who perhaps had high ideals, but he lacked the power or perhaps the goal to truly enforce the changes he dreamed of. He wanted a united Afghanistan, but perhaps he underestimated the depth of the divisions that existed within the country. I also believe that he overestimated his ability to retain power through cautious reforms without having support. Greater risks listened to those who wanted faster changes. After the coup in 1973, Afghanistan's arrangement quickly changed towards a republic and took a more radical direction, which in turn paved the way for even greater upheavals, including the Soviet Union's invasion, and later a long civil war. Zahir Shah lived in exile during these chaotic years while Afghanistan went through war, occupation, and civil conflicts. Many Afghans began to look back on Zahir Shah's time as a period of stability and peace, especially in contrast to the destruction that would later follow. When I look at his legacy, I see it as a reminder of the potential and the challenges of modernizing a country such as Afghanistan. He tried to create a modern society without compromising the traditional in any way, but he faced difficulties due to the enormous differences between urban and Hasi rural areas, as well as among different ethnic and cultural groups. He wanted Afghanistan to develop in its own way, but perhaps could not fully see the extent of the changes that were necessary to the country. Sweden's French significance for Afghanistan is hard to ignore. Even though his rule had its flaws, was it a time of peace and hope for many Afghans? He understood the importance of education, neutrality, and slow change. However, his limited reforms and cautious leadership caused him to lose touch with the growing generations that wanted to see more radical changes. His life is a reminder of the difficult balancing act between tradition and modernity, between preserving the country's culture and opening it up to the world. When we look back at Zahir Shah's time as the leader of Afghanistan, it is clear that he had a progressive view on women's rights, especially considering the time and culture in which he operated. During his rule from 1933 to 1973, several important steps were taken to include women in public life. In cities like Kabul, women gained greater freedom to participate in education and the workforce, and reforms were introduced that would allow women to contribute to the country's development in a way that truly matters, ensuring each action is thoughtful and impactful, contributing positively to the overall goal. Zahir Shah implemented a new constitution in 1964 that guaranteed women the right to vote and the opportunity to hold political positions. This constitution opened up opportunities for women to work in various professions such as teachers, nurses, and even in the government. This was a significant change in society where traditional gender roles had previously dominated. In many ways, one could say that he viewed women's rights as a part of Afghanistan's modernization. He realized that a modern society needs to benefit from its entire population, not just half of it. I think this step was very brave for his time. Implementing such reforms meant that he challenged deeply rooted traditions and values, especially in the countryside, where conservative norms prevailed. But at the same time, he chose to implement these changes gradually in order not to create too much unrest. This may be perceived as caution, but I see it as an expression of his respect for the Afghan people and culture, and for all traditions. He wanted to change, without imposing overly radical transformations on the people. How Afghanistan has changed since Zahir Shah's women's rights. If we compare Zahir Shah's era with today's Afghanistan, we see dramatic differences, especially since the Taliban regained power in 2021. After decades of war and conflict, the situation in the country has worsened, particularly for women. During the period between 2001 and 2021, when the Taliban were not in power, there was some hope for women's rights. Many women once again had the opportunity to educate themselves, work, and participate in community life. Women could attend university and work in various professional fields such as law, medicine, and engineering, and even participate in politics. But since the return of the Taliban, many of these advancements have been destroyed. The Taliban have imposed a strict interpretation of Islamic law that entails extensive restrictions on women. It has been forbidden to attend high schools and universities, and in many cases, also to work outside the home. In a short time, Afghanistan has gone from a situation where women's rights were slowly improving, to one where it returned to being heavily restricted. This difference is striking. Under Zahir Shah's rule, Afghanistan moved forward. Unfortunately, today's Afghanistan under Taliban rule is going in the opposite direction. When I look at how Zahir Shah tried to modernize Afghanistan, women's greater freedom makes it hard not to be impressed and a little melancholic. When I look at how Zahir Shah tried to modernize Afghanistan and give women greater freedom, it is hard not to be impressed. He was a leader who understood the importance of including women in societal development. Even though he was cautious in his reforms, his slow, balanced strategy can be questioned. Perhaps he should have been more radical in his changes, but I believe he did what he thought was best and aimed to create sustainable development. Today, however, the situation for women in Afghanistan is tragic. Considering the period of freedom and development that it experienced during the 1920s and later between 2001 and 2021, the current situation must be particularly painful for them. To go from having the right to educate oneself, work and participate in public life, To suddenly losing all these rights must feel like taking several steps back in time. I can't help but wonder how Afghanistan would look today if Saeed Shah's reforms had continued, or if the country had had the opportunity to develop without the decades of conflict that followed. The Chechen view on women's rights was far from perfect, but it was a beginning. It was an attempt to pull Afghanistan into a new era where everyone, regardless of gender, could contribute to the nation's progress. When we compared this to today's Afghanistan, we see how far the country has unfortunately fallen back. His policy, though cautious, was a beacon of hope for the women who longed for a better future. And even though his time as king is over, the legacy of his attempts to modernize Afghanistan remains relevant, especially when we look at the rights and freedoms that have regressed today, once again under attack. So what did you think of this video? What do you think of Saeed Shah's life? Did he make significant positive changes for Afghanistan, or did he not? Comment below, and give this video a thumbs up, and feel free to subscribe to the channel. More news will come. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.